Today's podcast episode is going to be one of many different episodes that are going to be what I'm going to loosely say are a collection. It's not quite a mini series, but I guess it could be grouped into that. And the working title right now, which is of course subject to change, would be something akin to the nature of work. It's not going to be a full history because I don't go back far enough, I think, back to the agricultural time frame. We make the transition into the Industrial Revolution. Nonetheless, it is a loose collection of things that I believe have impacted work in general for millions of people. In this particular mini-series, we are going to explore things like the social compact. We're gonna look at our employees, and this is a big one. But our employees less loyal today? This is something you hear over and over again. We're also going to explore a very divisive topic and a very disingenuous term like quiet quitting. I think that's actually how this whole thing got started. I began to do some research on quiet quitting, and I could sit here and connect the dots within what I'm going to say is, like, again, a collection of podcast episodes which will be turned into articles loosely based on the nature of work, primarily focused on the past 70 to 80 years, with particular focus on what has really taken place since probably about 1970 or so onward. Today's podcast episode is nothing more than an attempt for me to slake my curiosity and discuss the 2-week notice. Now, we're going to get into this, but to be blunt with you, I began to think, well, where did this originate? Where did it come from? Where did the 2-week notice even come from? Let's talk about some of the myths that are associated with the 2-week notice, some of the examples that actually happen with people and the 2-week notice, and what I believe will be the future of the 2-week notice. So with that, groundwork laid, let's kind of jump into this podcast episode. Now, when you go and look up the origin of the 2-week notice, you're not going to find a definitive, this is exactly how it got started. And the reason why is because there's nothing actually there that you can point to and say, like the 40-hour work week or the 8-hour work day or no child labor. Those are far easier to trace back to their origins. You can even go back to when people were pushing, throw back to what is a union, the collection of people that were pushing to have all of those things enacted. So you can see some groundwork up to when they were enacted, and then you can actually put your finger on dates. Here's when they were enacted. But the 2-week notice, you can't find that. If you do some research, you go online, you begin to look at, okay, well, how did the 2-week notice in fact come about in the first place? And you're not going to find anything concrete. Now, what you will find, and what I have found, are some estimations. You're going to find people that have written articles, or you're going to make educated guesses. And those very same educated guesses are based on observations are what I'm going to deliver today on the origins of the 2-week notice. So it's unknown. But the one thing that we can certainly say for sure is that it is what we would call a societal norm. It is something that is baked into, for the most part, the vast majority of the workplace today. We'll get into some of the examples in a little bit here, but the 2-week notice, it's on shakier ground in certain institutions and certain industries, which will kind of highlight that. But for the most part, it's just one of those societal norms that if you go to work for somewhere, it is baked into the culture that it's quote unquote customary that you give a 2-week notice. So it's a societal norm, first up. Number two, the second thing is that it's probable. It's more than possible. It's probable that it originated when in the, let's say, the 40s and the 50s, post-World War II, when a lot of companies were ramping up And they were putting the final touches on many of their HR manuals and, in fact, creating their HR departments in general. And with that, you began to see in employee handbooks this verbiage of a 2-week notice. It is customary that you give a 2-week notice. And what's likely to have kind of begun that process is the estimation that somebody worth their salt, a worker that was really good. I'm not talking about somebody in a saturated industry, but I mean a worker who just a company might have rough times, but the industry itself is, rock solid. Somebody who is worth their salt, at least during that time, would be on the market for roughly 10 days. This is something that I found out on one of the websites that I was doing some research on. And so the idea then behind that is, well, if they're on the market for 10 days, a 14-day or 2-week notice, if you will, ideally gives a company enough time, at least back in the 40s and the 50s, to begin to bring somebody on in the onboarding process. Now, as you are very keenly aware, just by using the noggin, you intuitively know that the time period for onboarding and the things that have changed, or the recognition, I should say, that things indeed have changed since the 40s and the 50s to today. What does that look like? What does that ultimately come about to? Well, back when you worked for, and this is where you would see it in employee manuals, and one of the reasons that it was quote unquote justified to give somebody a 2-week notice is that when we would you would go to work for a company, and this is in the 40s, in the 50s, in the 60s, and even for some people into the 70s. One of the things that you would see is that when you went to go work for that company or that corporation, the likelihood that you went to work for them for your entire career was relatively higher. And you went to go work for that company. And then when you went to go work for that company, you, of course, had a pension. I think you went to go work for this company. Of course, you had a pension. And with that pension, usually, at least at first, it was a 10-year vestment period. That obviously points to how long of a tenure you could expect to work for that company. And with all of that, there was, if you will, an expected loyalty from you, the employee, to the employer. And in some way, it felt like the loyalty was reciprocal, meaning the employer was also loyal to you. And here's 2 significant ways that you're able to clear that up. Number 1, you likely went to work for them for your entire career, for the most part. I'm broad brushing for multiple industries across the country, but that was the expected norm. And number 2, many of those companies also offered you what they call a single employer pension plan, a defined benefit. So you could expect to get retirement for the rest of your life. You could call it a simpler time, but that was a way that business was done, where you, the employee, were viewed as an investment. The company invested in you by that long-term employment as well as long-term retirement. And that was enough to put into your employer handbooks. We expect a 2-week notice. Now, with that context in mind, a 2-week notice does not seem so out of the norm. In fact, it seems as though we can tip our hat and say, you know what? That does make sense. A 2-week notice in that climate, then indeed, as far as we're concerned, it warrants giving your employer a 2-week notice. But the question remains today, is it something that we should provide employers today? So the rest of this podcast episode, we're going to explore that. We're going to explore some of the working conditions, some of the nature of work, if you will, which we'll explore these also in additional podcast episodes as we broaden our look into it. But for the most part, we're going to just touch on some highlights try and hit some 30,000 foot overviews and then reevaluate. Is a 2-week notice antiquated? Is it old fashioned? Is it warranted? Can an employer realistically expect a 2-week notice? And if so, what industries can they expect that in? Now, when you talk to some workers today, let's lay a little bit of groundwork here. Do companies today have single employer pension plans? The overwhelming majority do not. In the 70s, what you began to see was a transition from employer pension plans to the 401k monster. This is usually in the late 70s because it's about 40 plus years old, the 401k. This wouldn't have been bad if the employer would have put in the money into the 401k. But rather, what has ultimately happened to today, the only time, for the most part, again, we're broad brushing, but for the most part, what employers do is to quote unquote incentivize you, the employee, to put some of your hard-earned money into a 401k. They will offer you a measly match. This is a decided break and a great decline from a tremendous benefit of a pension plan where you went to go work for a company and you actually you realistically could retire, understanding and knowing that, yes, indeed, I do have steady income in the retirement years. Therefore, we can confidently understand and say that that is a significant difference as far as employer loyalty to the employee. Let's continue. Furthermore, back during that time when the quote unquote 2-week notice was instituted, it was not completely written in stone, but it was a societal norm that you were likely going to work for a company and it was going to likely be for the duration of your career. Or at least there was a significant possibility that that was going to be the case. In fact, you can take that to the norm, if you will, and say, and I'll address this in a completely different podcast episode, but I'll touch on this one little bit. It is often leveled at employees today that they are less loyal than their grandparents' generation. The reality is there's more opportunity today. And that's one of the significant differences, is that back then when you found a good job, and let's just say it was GE or it was Siemens or it was some other large corporation back then who you got employed with them, you could expect a single employer pension for the rest of your life into retirement, and you were going to go to work for them for a long time to come. What's perceived as employee loyalty was actually is two things. Number one, it was a response to employer loyalty and employer investment into their employees. And second, and perhaps even more importantly, there was a lack of opportunity. The amount of opportunity that Gen Z and the generation coming behind them has available today is enormous. All we need to do is look at how many other industries have crept up and been created in the past 25 years alone. Various social media companies. And in fact, just 25 years ago, we were accessing the internet via dial-up. There was nowhere near the amount of opportunity 50, 60, 70 years ago that there is today. And so what does that mean? That means more competition. And so the idea then, as you compare the conditions of when the 2-week notice was originated to today, it certainly seems like conditions are far less enticing and there's far less loyalty from employers to employees that don't make a 2-week notice sound good or necessary in a lot of ways. But let's cover some examples, some real world examples that you, the listener, and I know to be true. There are instances, even today, where a worker is trying to abide by that social norm. And one of the things that they will say is, I gave my 2-week notice and the company fired me. They fired me because they were angry. They were angry that I was leaving. And they were Never mind the fact that I may have gotten a better deal. A company may have given me more money, or, and this is just as likely to be honest, the toxic work environment that I happen to belong in has completely pushed me out. It has driven me out. It has taken the wind out of my sails. I did not want to work here anymore. An opportunity came my way that seemed to be better suited with better pay, better benefits, and to some degree, probably better coworkers or better management. And I took it. But abiding by that social norm, I offered a 2-week notice and I was fired. That has happened more times than many of us care to admit. You're trying to abide by the social norm and you have been dismissed instead. There are other workers who would say, why should I give a 2-week notice when I am not given a 2-week notice? They are summarily fired or summarily laid off, mass layoffs. They are cut out. And indeed, when you look at the nature of work, again, I don't even have to go back to the 40s and the 50s. We can talk from the 70s onward, and the shakiness of the economy and the way that employment uncertainty has increased significantly for a number of reasons. Many workers, especially the youth today, say they wouldn't give me a 2-week notice. Why should I give them a 2-week notice? And on the face of it, when we sit and we think about this, it may seem heartless as an approach to an employer, but is not mass layoffs or is not a targeted layoff without a severance package or without any notice at all? Wouldn't that be the same? You see, what's good for the goose in this thinking is good for the gander. What's good for someone, what's good for the employer should also be good for the employee. And that's the thought process that stems behind this. This is also the time in this podcast that I'll admit that there are specific industries that the 2-week notice seems to not really apply to at all. I'll speak from my own professional perspective. Those of us in the trades, those of us who are iron workers or pipe fitters or electricians, crane operators, etc., most of us live in the realm of the job's over, here are your 2 checks, I'll see you later. Most of us live in the realm of this other company gave me, is giving me X amount of dollars more. I'm out of here. I'm dragging up. Now, for those of you who don't know, dragging up is a common term those of us in the trades use for I quit, I'm going somewhere else. This is the norm. What's outside the norm, the exception, if you will, is to actually give your employer a 2-week notice. For the most part, many of us end up just dragging up and quitting that day, or we're out of here. You're going to get like, I'm out of here on Friday kind of stuff. And those employers know it, and they know it to be true because they also recruit other people in the trades as well. And they want those people to come over there to them as soon as possible as well. But outside of certain pockets, and I'm only speaking from the construction industry, from the trades perspective, outside of that, the societal norm, widespread, seems to be a 2-week notice. Now, what's interesting, when you begin to dig a little deeper, you can find instances online of employers requesting a longer notice than 2 weeks. They say it takes us more time to onboard employees. It costs us more. Therefore, we would really like, I've seen up to a 6-week notice. Now, the example that I'm referring to was not mandatory, but it was asked of employees. So in the 70 to 80 years, the employer loyalty has gone down. And in some instances, the requested loyalty from the employee to let me know you're going to leave is a 6-week notice or increased. So while the loyalty has gone down from the employer, the expected loyalty or the requested loyalty has increased from the employee, from a 2-week to a 6-week notice. And indeed, some more specialized fields actually seek to put it into contract that you will give us advance notice that you are leaving. I have seen examples and contracts of individuals in the healthcare field where they have contracts up to a couple months notice. They have contract examples where you will give the place of your employment a 2-month notice or a 3-month notice. These are all, and so now we get down, and with that in mind, now we get down to where I'm going to wrap this podcast up and talk about the creative ways that companies are exploring or are trying and attempting to use in a tight labor market. Instead of increasing employer loyalty, one of the things that they are looking to do is be a little bit more crafty when it comes to contracts or even the creative use of non-competes. The FTC asserts that non-competes as a whole are being used to stifle competition. I would say that they're right. And I'll take it a step further and say that non-competes are being used to lock employees in. We don't want to do the hard work, whatever that looks like in your respective industry, to recruit and to retain people. Ergo, we will lock them in with non-competes so that they cannot go to work for any of my competitors. The initial origination for non-competes was going to be for somebody who was up in a higher up position, or if you sold your company. I don't want you competing with me because you sold your company or you were in a policy making position. You made good money. You're in a policy making decision. I don't want you taking our trade secrets. But what they have morphed into is an enormous leviathan that locks people in to respective companies or geographic regions. And it does indeed stifle competition. And now you have people like the Chamber of Commerce who are attempting to get this ban on non-competes that the FTC has put out eradicated. They want that ban gone. They want to be able to continue to, what I would say is, abuse non-competes to lock people in. Well, this fits right in lockstep with what we were talking about. I don't particularly want a 2-week notice. I'd like to have a 6-week notice. Or I'd like to have a 2-month notice. Or I'd like to have no notice at all, and you stay right here under my employment. Do you have a contract? And that's the reality of it. The reality is most companies do not want to have a 2-week notice. Most companies don't even want to have a 4-week notice or a 6-week notice. What they really want is you to stay right where you're at, and under the current push that a lot of companies are exploring through non-competes and crafty contracts, that's exactly what they're getting. You are more likely to stay with that employer if you cannot find a job or are legally bound to the company that you're with. It doesn't matter if you had a 2-week notice, a 6-week notice, or whatever. When you have a non-compete that says you can't go to work for another contractor for 4 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, whatever. This is all being brought up because the nature of work has changed dramatically in the past 80 years. And it has not been a good change. It has continually eroded to a negative change where we are very suspecting of one another. We don't look at employees as an investment. We look to offshore any kind of training and any kind of improvements. And we just want to spend the bare bones money from an employer perspective and attempt to get the best. So where does this leave us? So at the beginning of this podcast episode, I mentioned, where did the 2-week notice come from? Well, we went beyond that. We explored the ramifications of how not just a 2-week notice began, but how it has changed and how the nature of work has changed and how the culture from a societal norm perspective has begun to shift where people are saying, I'm not even going to give you a 2-week notice. You wouldn't give it to me. This creates significant problems for not only for employers, but also for employees to navigate through. Rather, you value the people that you have working for you. You treat your human resources not as a department to protect your company, but as the most valuable resource you have, because that's exactly what they are. And if you'll do this, you have increased the likelihood that you'll recruit people, you'll retain people, and you'll attract new and top talent to your specific organization or industry. When you, as the employer, demonstrate that. And if someone decides to leave, for whatever reason it happens to be, maybe you'll get an increased notice. Maybe it won't be 2 weeks. Maybe it'll be a month or 6 weeks that you might have requested, because you invested in your employees. Now that is our exploration of the 2-week notice. Thanks for listening. I'll see you on the next one.